Hi, welcome to Mr. Dyer's Musings. My name is Mr. Dyer, and I am a social studies teacher and U.S. government teacher here in Central Ohio. Thank you for joining me today as we discuss and explore Civil War nurses. As always, I'd like to get out of the way and thank my wonderful wife and family for their unending support, for my incredible students who always urge me to learn more, uh, to help educate them and help to educate others. I'd like to thank you, my viewers, for checking out my videos and hopefully subscribing and liking them, passing them on to friends, and so we can share in this educational experience together. I'd also like to especially thank the Civil War Medicine Museum in Frederick, Maryland today. They just keep putting out more and more great videos, more great interviews with professionals that talk about and focus on Civil War medicine, which is a high interest of mine. So if you are a employee of the Civil War Medical Museum or one of the volunteers, thank you for everything that you guys do. Sincerely appreciated. All right, so Civil War nursing. When you, generally speaking, think about Civil War nursing, do you think about a female nurse that's tending to the wounded? Chances are, if that's your first exposure to Civil War nursing, and that's okay, and because there were a lot of women who helped out and participated in the war effort as Civil War nurses. But my video is primarily going to focus on the male nurses. That's really not talked about as much. There's been a ton of recent scholarly work regarding female nurses, and it's just fantastic. They have a lot of detail. It goes into the struggles of females at the time, the struggles of women being not equal to men in a patriarchal society. So if that's your interest, then I'm going to give you kind of a crash course, a few details about female nurses, but it's not something that I've done a sincere, heavy, devoted research on. But we will talk about female nurses at first, and then we'll walk into the male nurse side of things. So to be a female nurse, you actually had to apply to Miss Dix, who's Dorothea Dix, and she was responsible for all the nursing program for the United States Army, and she was appointed directly by Abraham Lincoln to try to figure out that effort. And Dorothea Dix didn't just want anybody who came to her to be a nurse. You actually had to apply. You had to be single. You had to be homely in appearance. And your heart had to be in the work itself, not so much in the men. Okay. So as a female nurse, you are going to dress very plain. You are expected to not look attractive, and you're going to do a lot of the same work that male nurses did, with a few differences. For the most part, you're going to work in the large cities, the large hospitals, not the field. There's a few outliers out there, though, like Clara Barton, and there's a few others that are pretty famous for their actions, but they were few and far in between. If you're going to represent a Civil War nurse, you need to go in the mindset like, hey, I'm not going to be this woman who's going to go out in the field and give water to the wounded on the front lines. It just didn't really happen as commonly as we kind of think. It happened, but just not that terribly common. As a female nurse, in a post hospital like Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and other places, you are going to do things like clean the bedpans, clean the sheeting, help change the men out of their clothes into regular clothes. You will help feed the men, and you may give water to the men, write letters for them, read to them, clean out the spittoons, some of that work. But you're not going to get so close to the men where your reputation could possibly be damaged. Giving baths, that's going to fall upon the male nurses, not the female nurses. A female's reputation was considered sacred in the 19th century, and even if that wasn't necessarily completely true, but that attitude was still very present in society. A really good book that I would suggest you reading if you're interested in female nursing is Hospital Days by Jane Stewart Woolsey. She gives really good accounts of not only the struggle of her being in a man's world, but also some very good detail about working in day-to-day nursing. Clara Barton also wrote some books about nursing, which that's really good. If you're into the Confederacy, there's a few Confederate nurses out there that wrote some pretty decent books. But my favorite is definitely that Hospital Days, Reminiscence of a Civil War Nurse by Miss Woolsey. All right, so that's the female nurse side of it. Now, as a male nurse, you are going to be a soldier, and you're going to represent the United States Army. And your day-to-day is going to be very structured. It's going to be very strict. And your duties are going to be laid out, for the most part, pretty much the same thing as kind of day to day. You have a routine, and you're going to be given some specific duties as well, here and there. I always like to use primary sources in my videos. So I have with me the Handbook for the Military Surgeon. And this one's by Tripler Blackman. There's another one that came out later in the war, but I'm going to go with the earlier war version to start us out. So in this book, on page 4, the medical officer selects the cooks, nurses, and matrons for his hospital. These selections must be approved by the commanding officer. The cooks and nurses are taken from the privates of the regiment. They are exempted from all other duty except the parades for muster and the weekly inspections of their companies. So that also means that as a nurse, you're not going to have to do picket duty. So that's pretty cool. When their services are necessary with the sick, they are also excused from these by the commanding officer upon the application of the surgeon. The allowance of hospital attendants for troops in the field is for 1 company, 1 steward, 1 nurse, and 1 cook. For each additional company, 1 nurse, and for the commands of over 5 companies, 1 additional cook. The duties of the steward are to take charge of the medicines, hospital stores, and supplies, to put up the prescriptions of the medical officer, to see to their distribution and administration to the sick, to enter in a book daily the issues to the cooks and nurses, to prepare the provision returns and receive and distribute the rations. The cooks and nurses are under his orders. He is responsible for the cleanliness of the wards, tents and kitchens, patients and attendants, and all articles in use. He will ascertain who are present at sunrise, at sunset, and at tattoo, and report absentees. All right, so there you go for a really quick breakdown. I'm going to come back to this book in a minute. But primary sources, reading from the manuals, is all well and good. But when you can get details from people that were actually involved in the war to kind of clear up the picture, I always like to do that as well. If you've watched any of my previous videos before, you know that I rely heavily on Dr. Wilder. Dr. Wilder was a surgeon in the 55th Massachusetts, which was a colored regiment, and he served primarily in the very South. And he got his surgency later in the, mid to late war. Before he became a surgeon, he served as a hospital cadet in Washington, D.C. And he wrote 2 books, or there's 2 books out there for him. The first one is Medical Cadet, and the other one's Practicing Medicine in a Black Regiment. When he served in Washington, D.C., there's a few more details specifically about nursing. Once he gets out to the field as the full surgeon, he doesn't really talk about it a whole lot. However, one point he did when he talks about the case of someone wanting to be a surgeon, there's this gentleman named David that he was quite impressed with, and he used him for a servant at a period of time, and then orders came through that you couldn't use enlisted men as servants, and that kind of faded away. But David was a non-commissioned officer in the 55th Massachusetts, and he actually resigned. Well, I can't say resigned, but he demoted himself, requested to be demoted. That way he could be a private and be a nurse. And he was getting non-commissioned officer pay, right? I was like, well, if you're a non-commissioned officer, why would you want to be a nurse? Well, if you think about it, especially when we refer back to the regulations, he was exempted from all extra duty. So a lot of times, especially in African American regiments, they were assigned to more tedious workloads. So going out, cutting wood, cutting roads, doing more menial labor kind of things. So that kind of sucks, right? But also you are exempted from things like picket duty, like I alluded to. Now, if you're on the picket, that means you are the first line of defense, and you're going to have to be there during the day, during the night, during shifts, etc. It's just not a very comfortable job. It's guard duty while the war's going on. So there's a few benefits as well. I'll come back to the pay of what a nurse is going to make. But another thing in this book, one that I really like, Miss Woolsey talks about nurses, and she refers to them sometimes as attendants. Okay, so here we go. There was never a critical case in hospital on which G's intelligence was not brought to bear in some shape. One of these nights a nurse came hurriedly up with the word, "There's a man dying in ward," doesn't say what. "We can't do anything for him. Has he taken anything since he came in?" "No. Can't eat nothing. Doctor says mustn't give him no stimulants, stomach's too weak." "I'll have a look at him," says G. And after the nurse goes out, the surgeon doesn't know a bronchitis from a broken leg. There's not a man in that ward who ought to die. If he is dying of starvation. She hunts up the doctor and asks if wine whey, W-H-E-Y, the lightest of stimulants, may be tried. Doctor didn't know what it was, but had no objection. Man couldn't live anyhow. The man took the cup full eagerly, was out of danger in the morning, got well. The doctor directing the nurse to be very particular to give him his wine whey regular, went back to the field and helped to take Richmond. It was delightful to see what changes rest, clean clothes, and a few good meals often made. Miserable heaps brought in on stretchers might be found in a week's time sitting up in dressing gowns with newspapers in their laps, and in a week more with paper collars and pomatum in their hair. These articles I am commissioned to buy, also patent hair dye. I have more than once bought a patent hair dye for the wards. Gregory had hair, and Barbe d'Afrique of the reddest color our eyes endure. Okay, so there you go. There's something talking about the discourse between nurses, especially female nurses, and the male nurses, and how the females responded directly to the surgeon, etc. So there's that back and forth communication. She also goes on to say on the next page, "The soldier nurses deserve good words. Many of them were the most faithful and devoted of men, clumsy and tender, kindly, eager, and heavy-handed. They did what they could. Only here and there one was found who was capable of drinking up the milk punch and setting the scrambled eggs aside for private banquets, and boldly wearing the flannel shirt given him for a patient. Old Smith meets me on my morning visit and tells me that he thinks the doctor in M ought to give Williams more stimulants." She said M, that's the ward, because they always label the wards with the letters. "That he has a discharging wound and faints after every dressing. I advise him to go and find the doctor and put the case to him. He comes back in glee with an order on the storeroom for punch and porter. Old Smith's patients always do well. He had a son in the army who was wounded and died far away from home. And then I couldn't stand it any longer, ma'am, and I went in myself. And now, whenever I get a young fellow like Williams to take care of, it seems like as if I was doing for my own boy, and it makes me feel better." In another ward, I encounter Vincent, who spells it with a "we," and who addresses me all in the breath. "Well, miss, 4 doctors in after me for their wards, but I think I'll stick by the old gentleman in the specs, or Dr. Havens, who, as far as I can see, is a gentleman too. I objected to Dr. Davis, though I won't say but what he's a nice little man enough. I hated to give him up, but them stairs, and now, when you see anything wrong in my ward, don't you be afraid to say so, though I do allow that my ward is the cleanest on the hill. Winton endorses the surgeon in charge. He's a quick man and a kind man, he says. He's a violent and a patient man. He'd get out of his bed and sick himself any time of day or night to go and see a sick soldier. Me and him never had no words whatsoever. Here's a ward master much elated with the importance of having smallpox break out in his ward, and a difficult one with whom I make an appointment to thread lint after his instructions. For I want some much better than any kind of lint that ever came into this hospital, ma'am. Okay, so there again you can see some of the back and forth bantering that went between the female nurse and the male nurse. And obviously she didn't think that the male nurses were doing that good of a job. But in truth, that's at least out in the field, and from what I've read from other surgeons, generally speaking, the male nurses were handpicked by the surgeons, right? So you actually had to have a quality about you. And if you got fired, there were people that were lined up to take your job. All right, let's go back to the surgeon's manual really quick and talk about it. All right. Let's talk about the pay and the selection. The senior medical officer is required to make the muster and payrolls of the steward, matrons, cooks, and nurses attached to his hospital on the forms furnished from the Adjutant General's office. The pay of the steward is that of the orderly sergeant of a company of a matron, $6 per month and 1 ration per day. The cooks and nurses are allowed 25 cents per day extra pay. It is the last item only that is entered upon the hospital rolls. The men are mustered upon their company rolls for the regular pay. The senior medical officer is required to make monthly to the medical director and quarterly to the Surgeon General a report of sick and wounded and of deaths and of the certificates of discharge and disability. All right, so 25 cents extra a day, and you also get your regular rations. So as a nurse, you're going to be handpicked from the surgeon. You're going to be a private. You're going to get paid 25 cents extra a day. There's some fringe benefits like we alluded to if you get the job. You're not going to be required to be on picket. You're not going to be required to cut those roads or cut down trees, etc., at least to the same extent. So there's some good things that's about being a nurse, right? Well, you've also got your day-to-day jobs, and there's only one really good book that breaks down the very specifics of an enlisted man's job in the medical department, and that is the Hospital Steward's Manual. If you're going to be a medical reenactor, or if you're a medical historian, you really need to get a hold of the Hospital Steward's Manual, because it is the most thorough breakdown of the job for the enlisted man. Now, it's the hospital steward. Now, in the hospital steward, you are the senior enlisted non-commissioned officer in the department. So it could be the hospital, it could be a field hospital. You're the senior enlisted guy, right? It's a pretty big job, and it tends to be a catch-all kind of job. So this was made or written by Woodward, and Woodward was the authority. He's the one who basically wrote this Bible, so to speak, for the enlisted side of things. Okay, the military hospital requires administration according to the strictest military discipline. Nothing short of this will secure efficiency. The surgeon holds the chief steward responsible for the condition of every part of the institution under his charge. The steward, on the other hand, holds his several subordinates responsible for the due performance of their duties. The details of these various duties are found throughout this work. Here, therefore, we limit ourselves to certain general regulations, which will be found necessary to maintain order. The roll call. A roll call of the stewards, ward masters, nurses, cooks, and other attendants or extra duty men should be held at least twice daily. At reveille and tattoo, noon roll call is also desirable. The steward should be called first, where practical. The nurses in charge of wards should be called next. Those are the ward masters. So if you're a nurse and you're responsible for a ward, you're a ward master. Each, as he answers to his name, should report whether all the patients under his care are present or not, a fact which he must ascertain by actual inspection before leaving the ward to go to roll call. These roll calls are of great importance in large hospitals. They should therefore be strictly regarded as a military duty, and all attendants not present should be punished as absent without leave unless excused on account of special duty. So a special duty might be like going with a surgeon or even be assigned to take a wagon and go get medical supplies from the Christian Commission or from another regiment. Wilder talks a lot about that and how there's these kind of irregular trips going into town and visiting various places. The following schedule will be found convenient for the business of the hospital. Reveille at 6:30 a.m. in winter and 5 a.m. in the summer. Morning roll call 15 minutes after. Breakfast call 7 a.m. in winter and 6 a.m. in summer. Surgeon's call 9 a.m. in winter and 8:30 in summer. Dinner 12, preceded by noon roll call when so ordered. Surgeon's evening call 5 p.m. Supper 6 p.m. Tattoo and evening roll call 8 p.m. and taps, lights extinguished at 9 p.m. So if you're not familiar with historical timekeeping, dinner was actually the largest meal of the day, and it was the noon meal, what we generally speaking call lunch today. And then supper was actually one of the smaller meals, and it was in the evening. These roll calls should, whenever possible, be sounded upon a bugle or beaten on a drum, in order that all patients and attendants may be informed. The hours for each call will, in every case, be regulated by the surgeon in charge. At Reveille, all attendants, so when we say attendants, those are the nurses, in such convalescents as are able to go, will rise, wash, and dress, after which each convalescent patient who is able will make his own bed. The attendants will make theirs, and will immediately proceed each about his several duties, such as sweeping the floors, the passage, etc., cleaning the spittoons, and similar work. And I always like to bring an artifact, if I have it, into these videos. And I just so happen to have a spittoon. So this is a spittoon. Why they call it spittoon? Well, tobacco was a horrible vice back then like it is today, and a lot of guys would chew or smoke tobacco, and the spittoon was used to collect that. And also, if you're hacking, if you're sick and you've got a cough or whatever, having a spittoon is pretty handy as well. At breakfast call, these convalescents who are able will go to the dining hall to breakfast, together with the attendants, except those whose duty it is to attend to the distribution of food to patients confined to bed. This distribution should be made while the convalescents are absent at their breakfast, and preparations having been previously completed so that the distribution may commence immediately after they leave the room. So while the guys are out getting their breakfast, you have the attendants that's going around, they're cleaning the beds, changing the sheets, etc. The convalescent patients should not be allowed to straggle irregularly through the house to their breakfast or any of the other meals. They should be drawn up in order in each ward by the chief nurse, who should call the roll to see that all those directed by the surgeon to take their meals at the general table are there, and no others, after which they should be marched by one of the attendants, one of the nurses, from the ward through the passages to the dining hall. After breakfast, they should be marched back in the same order. The attendants employed in the distribution of food, so to patients in bed, should receive their breakfast immediately after all the patients have received theirs. The chief nurse of each ward will see that immediately after breakfast the ward is put in order for the visit of the surgeon. No patient should be allowed to leave his ward after breakfast, except for necessary purposes, before the surgeon's visit. At surgeon's call, the several surgeons proceed to once to visit the wards under their charge, examining each patient carefully and causing the prescription and diet for each to be entered in the prescription and diet book. The prescription and diet book goes to the steward in charge of the dispensary, who puts up the medicines, attaching to each bottle, box, or package a label on which it is written, the number of the ward and bed, the name of the patient, date of the prescription, and the directions as to dose, time of taking, etc. The chief nurse of each ward should keep a slate on which he should enter opposite the name of each patient, the diet allowed, with any specific directions which may be given by the surgeon in individual instances. At dinner and supper call, the same general order is to be followed as was described for breakfast call. At surgeon's evening call, the regular second visits of the surgeon are made to those patients who require it in the same manner as in the morning. And at tattoo, all patients must make their preparations for retiring, and all must be in bed at 9 o'clock when taps should be sounded and unnecessary lights extinguished. Okay, so that kind of breaks down a military day on a post hospital. When you're out in the field, it's going to be very similar too. You're going to be doing things like sweeping. You're going to do things like changing out the bed linens, the bed sacks, doing washing for the men, helping them get dressed, helping them get undressed, bathing them. That's going to be very much a male-centered job. Help feeding them, give them water as they need it, read to them, write to them. You are going to patrol around the general camp, make sure that there's no trash or refuse laying around because sanitary conditions are highly enforced. Cleaning out the spittoons, cleaning out the bedpans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all very menial tasks, right? They're not so much medically centered. It's more about cleaning and just being an extra hand to the surgeon and to those who are feeling ill or who are injured, right? There are some other tasks that you might do to help the steward, such as preparing the bandages and the medicines, making sure that they're up on the shelf. You may be helping the cook in the kitchen, getting the food, and I'll talk about the cook here in a minute. You may help sit the men up. You might help carry men and wounded from the stretchers. You may help men walk to an ambulance, various things, like a bunch of menial tasks, right? So that's the general idea. I'm going to talk about the cooks as well in this video, even though that cook's kind of a separate job. But to be a cook, you have to be handpicked. And generally speaking, you got to be a good cook, right? Because you're going to get fired and someone else is going to take your job. As a cook, you're going to be responsible for the food preparation for the hospital. And it's no small or easy task because depending on the patient and their needs, they might have very strict dietary needs. They might be on a liquid diet. They might be on a heartier diet just to get their weight up. You might have to prepare stimulants to have ready whenever the doctors need it. A stimulant would be like a coffee or a tea. Now, the hospital steward's manual has a lot of good receipts, historically as they call them back then, or what we call recipes today. So it's a big job. It's a really big job. And each patient may have a very specific diet that you're going to have to attend to. Well, anyhow, so that's my rundown of nurses and of cooks, I guess. Female nurses was touched on earlier on. I hope it was of use. If you're wanting to get into medical reenacting, I would strongly suggest to get involved on the nurse level if you can find another medical group. Now, if you can't find another medical group to attach yourself to, then you might want to move on to the next higher level, which is my next video. I'll talk about ambulance corps. And honestly, it's where I started because there was no medical group immediately in my area that I could attach myself to. So I hope you learned something from it. I hope it was of interest. If you have any questions, please feel free to either make a comment or send me a message. I'd be happy to try to answer it for you. If you have any suggestions for primary sources such as memoirs or diaries or letters that talk about Civil War nursing, please let me know, especially male nursing. There's not a whole lot of specific details in the various memoirs I read, and I think a lot of that has to do with the military structure of things, because the military surgeons were kind of detached from it. They would talk to the hospital steward directly, and the hospital steward would filter or disseminate the information as necessary down to the other enlisted. So that's probably why. The only reason why Wilder really touches on nursing is because the guy was his servant, and he had an eye for detail, and he tried to help others. All right. If you haven't done so already, please like my video, please subscribe, please comment, please share. Every time that my video is liked and subscribed, it actually helps my channel and it gets the information out there for others so others can see it and learn from it. And I might get some feedback, which I always appreciate. As an educator, I always like reflecting and learning something myself. So thank you very much for joining me today. Check out my next video or check out my other videos. Next video is going to be about the hospital corpsman or ambulance corpsman. Thank you very much and have a great day.